Hi, welcome back to using Terraform with Azure. I'm Matt, and in this video, we're going to go over the Terraform state. I've actually been holding off on talking too much about the Terraform state because I really think it's important to understand the flow between initializing, planning, and applying before getting too into the weeds of state management. I've added a similar configuration to the one we created in a previous video to the folder for this lab in my GitHub repository, which is linked in the description if you'd like to follow along. I'm going to switch to the lab 1.6 directory, then go ahead and initialize and apply this configuration right now so we can look at some states. You may also need to run AZ login to authenticate to your Azure subscription. First, I'll initialize the directory. Then I'll run my Terraform apply. Great, now that's applied successfully. If you've been following along in this lab, you may have noticed a file pop up that I haven't really talked about. That file is terraform.tfstate. This is the Terraform State File. The state file is an integral part of what makes Terraform able to do what it does best. In this file, Terraform will store information about your managed infrastructure and configuration. So let's take a look and open up the Terraform state file. You can see that the TF state file contains some JSON. This JSON is what describes the current state of your infrastructure as recent as your last Terraform apply. Basically, this file will store bindings between objects in a remote system, like Azure in this example, and the resource instances you declare in your configuration files. There needs to be a one-to-one relationship between the resource in your state and a resource in your configuration files. If I scroll down to line 33 in my state file, we can see the binding for the resource group RG01 that I created. It's mapped to the resource in the configuration by the type and name. And a little further down under attributes, we can see the ID of the remote object in Azure. That creates the one-to-one relationship that I mentioned earlier. Under attributes, we can also see the settings that we specified in the configuration, such as location and tags. When Terraform runs an apply and creates a new remote resource, it will record the ID of that resource, link it to the corresponding resource instance in your configuration, then it will use that information to update or delete that remote object on subsequent applies if the configuration is changed. According to this state file, Terraform knows that a remote object called RG01 exists, and its location should be East US 2, and there should be an environment tag with the value of staging. If any of those details change on the remote object, the next time Terraform runs a plan or apply, Terraform will prompt to change those attributes back to what we see in the state file, unless you also make those same changes to your configuration. A couple things that could trigger changes would be either you update one of your resources in your TF files, or manually updating Azure resources in the Azure Portal UI, PowerShell, or through Azure CLI commands. Those will also trigger Terraform to determine if an update needs to happen to a resource in your state. If I scroll up a little bit in the state file, you'll also notice that the results from my data lookup for RG-test01 are also stored here, and will be updated if any changes are detected on a subsequent apply. And a little further up, we can see the outputs on line 6. This configuration outputs the ID for the storage account too, so that information is stored in the state as well. Okay, let's close the state file and take a look at some of the Terraform commands that we can run against the state. Even though the state file is in JSON format, it's not recommended that you manipulate or query it directly, since the formatting could change in future versions of Terraform. Instead, we have a few commands we can run which we can rely on to be compatible with whatever the current formatting is. If I run this command to get the help for the Terraform state commands, we can see the list of commands that are available to us. In this video, I'm going to cover the list, rm, and show commands. First, let's start with the list command. When I run terraform state list, it returns all resources in the current state. Looking at the names, we can identify all our resources by how we set up their resource blocks, and they use the same format that we've used previously when setting up implicit dependencies between resources. Next, let's take a look at the show command. Terraform State Show takes the list command a little further and shows you the attributes of a single resource in your state file. In the terminal, type Terraform State Show. Then, let's just copy the name of RG1 from the output of the list command and paste that at the end. This should look a little bit familiar. If I go back into my main.tf file, you can see that the command has given us back what we've basically defined in lines 1 through 8. The only difference is that the state is storing the resource group's ID from Azure, so it can reach out and gather the resource's current state to compare it to our local state. Let's do the same for SA1. As you can see, it looks pretty similar, except it has some more attributes available. Now, although this next command doesn't technically fall underneath the Terraform State commands, I'm going to show it here. That command is Terraform Show. Terraform Show works in a similar way to Terraform State Show, except it returns your entire state. This can come in handy when trying to troubleshoot a configuration or when importing resources, which we'll cover shortly. And if you'd like to get this information in a more consumable fashion, you can also add -JSON to the end of the command, and it will return the state in JSON format. That's obviously not as readable to the human eye, but this would be perfect for a PowerShell script or any other script you might have. Okay. The last state command I'm going to show you here is Terraform State RM. Terraform State RM can be used to remove a state binding to a remote object without destroying that remote object. Essentially, this removes that resource from your current state, but doesn't remove the resource out in Azure. If you have a resource in your configuration that you no longer want to manage with Terraform, however, you don't want to destroy it, you would just need to run Terraform State RM and specify the name of the resource you want to remove, and Terraform will no longer try to compare its state to that remote object. Let's try this out. Let's go ahead and run Terraform State RM against our SA3 resource. We've now successfully removed storage account 3 from our state. However, we're not quite done yet. Let's go ahead and run a quick plan now. Notice how it wants to create a new storage account now. However, that storage account still exists out in Azure, so an apply would fail here. Earlier I mentioned that there needs to be a one-to-one relationship between the resources you have defined in your configuration and the objects in the state file. Right now, we have a resource in our configuration under main.tf that doesn't have a reference in our state file, because we just removed it. Now we need to remove the declaration of our configuration. So let's go ahead and delete the resource block for SA3 and save the file. Now when we run a plan, we shouldn't see any changes being made. Now that we've covered the steps for removing a resource from the Terraform state, what happens when you want to take an existing resource out in Azure and put it into your state so you can start managing it with Terraform? For that, we're going to use the Terraform import command. The Terraform import command will do exactly what I just described. It will import existing infrastructure into your current state and create a binding between the two. It currently does not, however, generate configuration code for the resource. We'll have to do that ourselves. To demonstrate Terraform import, let's try to import the storage account that we just removed back into the state. The best way I found, especially when starting out with imports, is to go to the documentation. Let's go check out the documentation page for Azure RM storage account. If I scroll all the way down to the bottom of the page, I can find the import example. This will show us what the import command is looking for. The command is made up of 3 parts. First, the command terraform import. Next is going to be the resource name. You may remember that we used that in the terraform rm command previously. Next, you need to provide the ID of the remote resource you're importing, a storage account in this instance. Back in the terminal, let's start with Terraform import. After that, we need to provide the name of the configuration block for the resource that we're importing. The name of the resource is going to be Azure RM storage account.sa3. Now, let's create an empty resource block for that resource since we need to match our configuration to our state. We don't need to provide any attributes at this time, so let's save the file with it blank for now. Next, we need to provide the ID of that storage account. Let's go to the portal to find that ID. When I browse to the resource group, I can see the storage account that I want to import. Just as a note, I've had to change the names a little bit from previous videos, because of the fact that storage account names need to be globally unique. Alright, so let's click on that storage account. Now this is where some familiarity with Azure may come in handy. The ID isn't always in the same place for all resources. Some may be under a properties section on the left, and some might display the ID right on the overview page, so you may need to do some digging. But for storage accounts, scroll down to endpoints under settings on the left. And the storage account resource ID is right at the top. Click on the copy icon. And let's go back and paste that at the end of the command. Great. We should be all set to run the import now, so let's hit enter. If all goes well, the import should be successful. And we should see the storage account back in the state when we run Terraform State list. Now we have one more step. Because we left the resource block empty, a plan or apply would fail. You have a couple of options here. You could just manually build the resource block for this storage account, filling in the attributes to match the remote object. Or you can utilize the Terraform State Show command to help you out. Let's go ahead and run Terraform State Show against the storage account we just imported. Now let's go ahead and copy the output from that command to our blank resource block. Now, there are a lot more attributes here than we set last time. Mostly just things that are set by default if they aren't specified. There are also a lot of non-configurable attributes in here, like ID, that would cause a plan or apply to fail here. So what I usually do is just pare down this to just the attributes I want to manage with Terraform, making sure to remove any IDs or other non-configurable attributes. Okay, now it should look a little more like how we had it originally before we removed it. Save that file and let's run a plan. We should hopefully see no changes to be made. Now let's go ahead and destroy those test resources. I hope that helps shed some light on how Terraform uses state to maintain your infrastructure. In the next video, I'm going to go over how to use modules in Terraform. Both modules from the registry and a module that we're going to build and use locally. So make sure to check it out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.